1,000 miles, that is the distance between the earthquake that tore open the seafloor off Mexico yesterday and the fault that runs beneath Los Angeles. Far too far, the physics says, for one to reach out and touch the other. And yet the instant that magnitude 7.3 struck, the people who watch these faults for a living did something strange. They turned their backs on Mexico and fixed their eyes on California. Because in that same week, researchers confirmed the faults beneath Southern California are carrying more stress than they have in 1,000 years, and up around San Francisco Bay, the ground has gone quiet in a way nobody who truly understands it finds comforting. So why does a violent earthquake in another country have the experts this nervous about our own West Coast? Before we get into it, if you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our nightly debriefs, and drop a comment to let me know where you're watching from tonight. Now let's get into it. Part 1. The morning. It struck. Yesterday morning, the ground off the coast of southern Mexico moved with the force of tens of millions of tons of high explosive, and the entire western edge of North America felt it. Not as a jolt, not as anything most people would notice, but as a signal, travelling through solid rock at thousands of miles an hour, arriving under Nevada and Wyoming and California within minutes, whispering across every seismograph on the continent. The people who watch those instruments for a living saw the needle jump, and then they did something that might seem strange. They turned their eyes away from Mexico, and they looked north, toward home. The earthquake itself came in violent. The first automated estimate put it at magnitude 7.4, striking off the Pacific coast near where Mexico meets Guatemala, out along a scar in the seafloor that runs the length of Central America. Within a short time, the number was refined down to magnitude 7.3. That small downward revision is completely routine for a large event. The first estimate is a machine's best guess from the earliest waves to arrive. The refined number comes later, after human analysts have fed the full record of the rupture through their models. A drop of 1/10 of a magnitude unit sounds like the earthquake got weaker. It didn't. The earthquake was exactly as large as it always was. We just measured it more carefully. And here is the first thing you need to understand, because it is going to run underneath this entire story like a current. A magnitude 7.3 earthquake off Mexico on that particular stretch of coastline is not an anomaly. It is not a surprise. It is not, by the standards of that place, even especially rare. Seismologists looked at this rupture and within hours were describing it as textbook. Normal. Expected. The aftershocks that followed behaved exactly the way aftershocks are supposed to behave. The tsunami it generated was so small it barely lifted the tide. So if the earthquake was normal, if everything about it fit the pattern, why are we here? Why did the scientists turn and look at the west coast of the United States? Why does a quiet, expected, by-the-book earthquake in another country have people who study these things watching California with something that looks a lot like unease? That is the question this whole video is going to answer, and I am going to give you the shape of the answer right now, in the first few minutes, because I do not believe in making you wait 2 hours for the point. The answer is this. The earthquake off Mexico did not and could not load the San Andreas fault. Those two systems are separated by more than 1,000 miles of independent geology, and the physics that would let one reach out and squeeze the other simply does not work across that kind of distance. Anyone telling you that Mexico just pulled the trigger on the big one in Los Angeles is wrong, and later in this video I'm going to show you exactly why, in a way that will make the reason obvious. But the earthquake did do something. It arrived. It arrived on a specific day, at a specific moment, and the timing of that arrival is the entire story. Because in the same week that the seafloor tore open off Mexico, an independent line of research confirmed that the fault system running underneath Southern California is now carrying more stress than it has at any point in the last 1,000 years. Not in decades, not in a century, in a millennium. And at the same time, in the north, around San Francisco Bay, the ground has gone strangely, unnervingly silent, in a way that the people who watch it do not find comforting at all. The Mexican earthquake, in other words, was not the danger. It was the spotlight. It swung around and lit up a stage that was already set, and the thing standing on that stage has been waiting there, quietly, for a very long time. I want to be honest with you about why I'm framing it this way, because the easy version of this story, the one that gets the most clicks, is the domino version. Mexico shakes, then California, then the whole West Coast unzips in a chain reaction. It is a thrilling story. It is also wrong, and I would rather give you the true version, which turns out to be more unsettling than the fake one, not less. The true version is not that one earthquake reaches out and topples the next. The true version is that the West Coast is already sitting on top of several independently loaded fault systems, each one keeping its own private clock, and that a distant earthquake did nothing to any of them except make us finally look. The fear in the domino story is that something out there is coming for us. The fear in the real story is that it is already here, underfoot, and has been the whole time. One of those stories you can dismiss by checking the map and seeing the 1,000 miles of separation. The other one you cannot dismiss at all, because it is measured, published, and sitting quietly beneath tens of millions of people right now. Let me take you back to the morning it happened. It was mid-morning, local time, on Friday, the 17th of July, 2026. Out along the Middle America Trench, the boundary where one of the planet's tectonic plates dives beneath another, a section of that boundary that had been locked and straining for years finally gave way. The overriding slab of the North American plate, which had been bent and held like a compressed spring, lurched forward and upward. That sudden motion is what we felt as the earthquake. The United States Geological Survey, looking at the pattern of the waves, described it as reverse thrust faulting on or near the subduction zone plate interface. In plain language, this was a megathrust earthquake, the same family of earthquake that produces the largest ruptures the planet is capable of. The shaking radiated outward. The tsunami warning centers around the Pacific did exactly what they are built to do. They issued an alert because any large earthquake on a subduction zone has the potential to shove the seafloor and displace the ocean above it. Then they watched the tide gauges, and the wave, when it came, was minor. On the order of half a foot above the normal tide, enough to register. Nowhere near enough to threaten anyone. Within a reasonable window, the threat was stood down. Roughly 30 minutes after the main shock, a second large earthquake struck the same area, a magnitude 6.0. That is a significant earthquake in its own right, the kind that would make headlines on any ordinary day. But following a 7.3, it was not a separate event and not a surprise. It was an aftershock, and as of the latest data, it stands as the largest aftershock in the sequence. Behind it came the smaller ones, the magnitude 5s, one after another. Quite a few of them, in fact. Into the early hours of Saturday, a 5.2 registered as the largest of the overnight aftershocks, and every seismologist looking at that sequence said the same thing. This is normal. This is what a 7.3 does. There was no sign of anything out of the ordinary, no pattern that suggested something worse was building. The expectation now is for maybe one or two more magnitude 6 aftershocks over the coming days, with an outside chance that the very largest aftershock could climb into the upper 6s. All of that too would be ordinary. So we have an earthquake that was violent, but expected. A tsunami that was real, but tiny. An aftershock sequence that was busy, but textbook. Every single piece of it, taken on its own, is the kind of thing that happens on this planet all the time, and yet the story does not end there. Because to understand why this particular ordinary earthquake matters, you have to understand the machine that made it. You have to understand what's happening in the rock beneath that trench, why it produces earthquakes at all, and why the same forces that broke the seafloor off Mexico are the forces slowly winding up the most dangerous fault in the United States. That machine is where we're going next, and once you see how it works, the connection between these two coastlines is going to look very different than the headlines make it sound. Part 2. The Machine Beneath the Trench. There is a place off the coast of Mexico where the floor of the Pacific Ocean is being swallowed by the planet, a few centimeters at a time, and has been for millions of years. It does not stop. It does not rest. And every so often it screams. Yesterday it screamed. To understand the earthquake, you have to understand the Middle America Trench. It is a long, curving depression in the seafloor that runs down the western side of Mexico and Central America, and it marks one of the great collision zones on Earth. It is part of a much larger feature that circles most of the Pacific Ocean, a nearly continuous belt of subduction zones and volcanic arcs that we call the Ring of Fire. Something like 90% of the world's earthquakes and a huge share of its active volcanoes are strung along this ring because it traces the edges where the Pacific and its neighbouring plates are being consumed back into the Earth. The Middle America Trench off Mexico is one arc of that ring. The Cascadia subduction zone off the Pacific Northwest is another. The trenches off Japan, off Kamchatka, off Tonga, and New Zealand and Chile all links in the same great chain of destruction and creation that rims the ocean. So when you place yesterday's Mexican earthquake on the global map, it is not an isolated dot. It is one flare-up on a ring of fire that is, somewhere along its length, always burning. On one side you have the vast North American plate, the slab of rock that carries Mexico and most of the continent above it. On the other side, sliding in from the Pacific, you have a smaller oceanic plate called the Cocos Plate, and where these two meet, the Cocos Plate loses. Being denser oceanic crust, it bends downward and dives beneath the edge of North America, plunging into the hot interior of the planet in a process we call subduction. This is not a gentle process. The two plates do not slide past each other cleanly. They catch. They lock together along the interface where they touch, held by nothing more than friction and the immense pressure of the rock above. And while they are locked, the plates keep moving. The Cocos Plate keeps pushing northeast, into and under North America, at a rate the Geological Survey measures at around 76 millimeters per year. That is about 3 inches a year, roughly the speed your fingernails grow. Across the whole span of the trench, the rate varies with location, and by some regional measures runs closer to 88 millimeters a year. It sounds impossibly slow, but that motion never stops, and the rock along the locked interface cannot move with it. So the rock bends, it stores the strain, it compresses like a spring being wound tighter and tighter across years and decades. And then, when the accumulated stress finally exceeds the strength of the friction holding the fault shut, the interface fails. The locked section lets go all at once. The overriding plate, which had been dragged down and bent inward, snaps back upward and seaward in a matter of seconds. Every bit of strain that took years to accumulate is released in one violent lurch. That is a megathrust earthquake. That is what happened yesterday. The reverse thrust motion the Geological Survey described is exactly this, the upward, overriding snap of the North American plate as it recovers the ground it had been slowly losing to the Cocos Plate below. I want you to sit with the scale of the energy involved, because it matters for something we are going to discuss later. A magnitude 7.3 earthquake releases energy on the order of tens of megatons of high explosive equivalent. And the way the magnitude scale works is not the way most people assume. It is not a straight line. Each whole step up the magnitude scale represents roughly 32 times more energy released. So a magnitude 7 is not slightly bigger than a magnitude 6. It is about 32 times bigger in energy. A magnitude 8 is not slightly bigger than a 7. It is about 32 times bigger again, which means an 8 is roughly 1,000 times the energy of a 6. This is why, when we start comparing yesterday's 7.3 to the largest earthquakes this trench has ever produced, the difference is going to be staggering, even though the numbers look close together. Now, here is a subtlety that most coverage will skip right over, but that I think is genuinely fascinating, and it tells you something about how these subduction zones actually work. Not every large earthquake at this trench happens the same way. Yesterday's quake was an interface event, a rupture along the contact surface where the two plates are locked together. That is the classic megathrust. But the plate that is diving downward does not simply vanish. It keeps going, deeper and deeper, bending as it descends, and that bending puts its own kind of stress on the slab itself, deep inside the earth, far below the interface. Sometimes the slab cracks internally, under that bending stress, and produces what we call an intra-slab earthquake. Same trench, completely different mechanism. One is the two plates unlocking at their contact. The other is the descending plate tearing apart under its own weight and curvature, sometimes 50 or 70 kilometers down. Why does that distinction matter? Hold on to it, because in a few minutes I am going to tell you about the largest earthquake this stretch of coastline has produced in modern history, and it was not an interface quake like yesterday's. It was the other kind. And the difference between those two failure modes is part of why this trench is so dangerous and so hard to fully predict. There is more to the machine, though, and the more you understand about it, the clearer the connection to our own coastline becomes. Consider where the Cocos Plate even comes from. It is born out in the eastern Pacific, at a great undersea volcanic ridge called the East Pacific Rise, where fresh molten rock wells up and hardens into new seafloor. From the moment it's created, that new crust begins a slow, doomed journey eastward, cooling and thickening and growing denser as it ages, until it reaches the Middle America Trench and dives to its destruction. Because it is young and relatively warm compared to some other oceanic plates, the Cocos Plate subducts at a fairly steep energetic angle, and the earthquakes it produces trace its descent. If you plot the depths of earthquakes moving inland from the trench, they get systematically deeper, following the diving slab down into the mantle along what geologists call a Wadati-Benioff zone, a sloping plane of seismicity that is essentially a shadow of the plate falling into the earth. Yesterday's interface quake was one point on that descending plane. The intraslab quakes happen further down it. Same slab, different depths, different failure modes, all part of one continuous plunge. The single most important concept in all of this, the one that ties Mexico to California to the Pacific Northwest, is the idea of locking, or what seismologists call coupling. Not every subduction zone is locked the same way. On some, the two plates slide past each other relatively smoothly, releasing their motion in a steady creep with few great earthquakes. On others, the plates are strongly coupled, gripped tight along the interface, storing decades or centuries of motion before releasing it all at once. The degree of coupling is what determines how big and how frequent the earthquakes will be. And the portion of the fault that is capable of this locked catastrophic behavior has a name. It is called the seismogenic zone, the depth band, generally from near the surface down to a few tens of kilometers, where the rock is cool enough and brittle enough to lock and then snap. Above it, the rock is too soft and wet to store much stress. Below it, past a certain depth, the rock gets hot enough that it flows and slips rather than sticks. It is only in that middle band, the seismogenic zone, that a fault can wind up like a spring and release like a whip. Yesterday, off Mexico, a patch of that seismogenic zone let go. And the reason I am drilling into this is that the San Andreas has a seismogenic zone too, and so does Cascadia. And understanding that these are all variations on a single physical theme is the foundation for everything that follows. For now, the thing to carry forward is this. What broke off Mexico yesterday was a spring that had been winding for years, releasing its stored energy in a single reverse thrust lurch along a locked plate boundary. It is a machine that runs on the slow, relentless motion of the planet's plates, a machine that has no off switch, and a machine that, crucially, exists in more than one place. Because that same fundamental process, plates locked together, straining, storing energy for a sudden release, is not unique to Mexico. A version of it is happening right now underneath California, and another version underneath the Pacific Northwest. The trench off Mexico just showed us, in real time and in violent detail, what the end of that process looks like. The question that should be forming in your mind is the one the seismologists are already asking. If that is what a release spring looks like, how tightly wound is the one underneath our own coastline right now? Before we can answer that, we need to finish reading what the machine off Mexico did after the main break, because the aftermath tells us how healthy, or how unstable, the system really is. Part 3. Reading the aftershocks. An earthquake does not simply happen and end. It echoes. In the hours and days after a large rupture, the ground around the break continues to adjust, snapping and settling into its new configuration in a cascade of smaller earthquakes we call aftershocks. And to a trained eye, the pattern of those aftershocks is a kind of diagnostic readout. It tells you whether the system is behaving normally or whether something unusual is happening beneath the surface. Yesterday, the readout off Mexico came back clean, almost boringly clean. And understanding why that matters means understanding what these sequences are supposed to look like. When the main shock hit, the largest section of the fault released. But a rupture that size does not relieve stress evenly. In some places, it actually increases the load on adjacent patches of rock, patches that were not part of the main break. Those patches then fail in turn, producing aftershocks. The biggest of these came about 30 minutes after the main event, the magnitude 6.0 I mentioned earlier. In the ordinary rhythm of aftershock behavior, that fits a well-known pattern. There is a rough rule of thumb in seismology that the largest aftershock tends to be around 1 magnitude unit smaller than the main shock. A 7.3 main shock producing a 6.0 largest aftershock sits comfortably inside that expectation. Nothing about it raised an alarm. Below the 6, the sequence filled in the way it should. A run of magnitude 5 earthquakes, 5.0, 5.2, on up and down the scale scattered through the rupture zone. Into the overnight hours and past midnight into Saturday, a 5.2 logged as the largest of the late aftershocks. To someone watching a live seismic feed, this looks like a busy, active zone. Dozens of earthquakes that on any other day would each be notable. But in context, this is exactly the sound a magnitude 7.3 makes as it settles. It is the system bleeding off the stress that the main shock redistributed in a decaying series that will gradually taper over the coming days and weeks. Now, the reason a seismologist finds this reassuring, rather than alarming, is that they have seen the other thing. They have seen aftershock sequences that do not behave. There are cases in the historical record where what looked like a main shock was followed by aftershocks that were unusually large, unusually close in magnitude to the first event, a sign that the first earthquake was not actually the main event at all, but a foreshock to something bigger still to come. When a magnitude 7 is followed by aftershocks creeping up toward that same magnitude, that is when the people watching lean forward in their chairs. That is the pattern that, in a handful of historic cases, preceded an even larger rupture days later. Yesterday's sequence showed none of that. The aftershocks stepped down in magnitude the way they are supposed to. The largest was a full magnitude unit below the main shock. The system was releasing, not reloading. The orderly way that aftershock sequence decays is not just a vague impression. It follows a mathematical law that has been known for well over a century. In the 1890s, a Japanese seismologist named Fusakichi Omori studied aftershock sequences and found that their rate falls off in a predictable way, rapidly at first and then more slowly, tapering along a smooth curve as the days pass. The modified version of that relationship, Omori's law, is still used today to forecast how many aftershocks to expect and how quickly they will fade. When a seismologist looks at yesterday's sequence and calls it typical, part of what they mean is that it is tracking that curve, decaying on schedule, behaving like a system releasing energy rather than one building towards something new. And that rule about the largest aftershock being roughly 1 magnitude unit smaller than the main shock, that has a name too. It is called Bath's law, after another seismologist who noticed that the gap between a main shock and its biggest aftershock tends to hover around 1.1 or 1.2 magnitude units, remarkably consistently, regardless of the size of the main shock. A 7.3 main shock and a 6.0 largest aftershock give a difference of 1.3. Slightly larger than average, which if anything means the sequence has been, if you will forgive the phrasing, well behaved, its biggest aftershock a touch smaller than the statistics would have predicted. None of this is guesswork. It is a system doing exactly what more than 100 years of observation says it should. There is one more wrinkle worth mentioning, because it speaks to how carefully you have to read this data. The Geological Survey noted that 2 small foreshocks preceded the main earthquake. A foreshock is simply a smaller earthquake that comes before the main one, on or near the same fault, that in hindsight we recognize as a prelude. But here is the honest complication. That stretch of coastline is seismically busy every single day. On a completely ordinary day, with no main shock coming, that region produces 3s, plenty of 2s, the occasional 4. So when we say there were 2 foreshocks, we have to be careful. In a place that is always trembling a little, deciding which small quakes were true foreshocks and which were just the normal background chatter is partly a judgment call, something we can often only sort out after the fact. It is a good reminder that even our cleanest-looking data is an interpretation, not a photograph, and it points at one of the hardest, most frustrating truths in this entire science. The overwhelming majority of small earthquakes are not foreshocks to anything. They are just small earthquakes. Only a tiny fraction of them turn out, in hindsight, to have been the prelude to a larger event, and there is no reliable way, in the moment, to tell which is which. A magnitude 3 that is actually a foreshock looks identical, on the instrument, to the thousands of magnitude 3s that lead to nothing at all. This is the deep reason earthquakes remain, to this day, fundamentally unpredictable in the short term. We can measure the stress. We can calculate the probabilities over years and decades. We can recognize a foreshock the day after the main shock arrives. But we cannot look at a small quake today and know whether it is a warning or just noise, and anyone who claims otherwise is claiming something the science does not support. That humility is not a weakness of the field. It is the honest edge of what is knowable, and it is exactly why the long-term stress picture matters so much more than any single tremor. And that same tiny tsunami tells a similar story of a system behaving within known limits. A megathrust earthquake displaces the seafloor, and when the seafloor jumps, it shoves the water column above it, launching a tsunami. The size of that tsunami depends on how much seafloor moved, how much it moved vertically, and how deep the water was. Yesterday's rupture produced a wave measured in inches above the normal tide, roughly half a foot. That is a sign that while the earthquake was large, the vertical shove of the seafloor in the places that mattered for wave generation, was modest, and the geometry did not focus a dangerous wave toward any populated coast. It is worth understanding why the tsunami warning goes out at all for an earthquake like this, and why standing it down so quickly is not a failure but a success. The moment a large earthquake strikes on or near a subduction zone, the warning centers do not yet know whether the seafloor jumped vertically enough to launch a dangerous wave. They cannot wait to find out, because a tsunami in the open ocean travels at the speed of a jetliner, 500 miles an hour or more across deep water, where the wave is only a foot or two high and passes under ships completely unnoticed. It is only when that fast, low, deep water wave reaches the shallows near a coast that it slows down, piles up, and grows into the towering wall we picture. That slowing and piling process is called shoaling, and it is why a wave that is invisible at sea can become lethal at the shoreline. So the warning goes out immediately, on the assumption of the worst, and then the tide gauges, the real sensors floating out on the water, report back what actually happened. Yesterday, they reported a wave of a few inches. The system did exactly what it was designed to do. It assumed danger, checked reality, and found that this time the ocean had barely stirred. That is the difference between a shrug and a catastrophe, and yesterday the ocean shrugged. So step back and look at the whole picture off Mexico. A large but expected megathrust. A largest aftershock exactly where the rule of thumb says it should be. A decaying sequence of smaller quakes releasing stress in an orderly way. A minor tsunami. Foreshocks that may or may not have been foreshocks. Every indicator pointing to a system that did something violent but ordinary, and is now settling back down. If this were the whole story, it would be a footnote, a strong earthquake in a place that gets strong earthquakes, causing little damage, fading into the background. But it is not the whole story, and the reason it is not has nothing to do with how the earthquake behaved, and everything to do with where and when it happened. Because this same trench, this same machine that just performed so predictably, has a history. It has produced earthquakes that make yesterday's 7.3 look small. And to understand why the people watching are nervous, you first have to see just how much worse this particular stretch of the Earth is capable of getting. That history is where we turn next, and it starts with an earthquake that split a piece of the planet nearly in two. Part 4. The Ceiling. On the 8th of September 2017, the same stretch of coastline that just produced yesterday's 7.3 produced something that belongs in a different category entirely, a magnitude 8.2. The largest earthquake to strike Mexico in a century, and to understand why the seismologists watching yesterday's event kept one eye on the history books, you need to feel the gap between those two numbers. Remember the scale. Each whole step up is roughly 32 times the energy. Yesterday was a 7.3. The 2017 earthquake was an 8.2. That is nearly a full magnitude unit larger, which means the 2017 event released something on the order of 20 to 30 times more energy than the earthquake that just rattled the coast. When you look at a headline that says 7.3 and then a headline that says 8.2, your brain files them next to each other, close cousins, roughly the same. They are not. One is a serious earthquake, the other is a monster that killed dozens of people, damaged tens of thousands of homes, and generated a tsunami that put the entire region on alert. 98 people died in that earthquake. It is the ceiling this trench has shown us in modern memory, and it is a reminder that yesterday's event was operating well below the maximum this machine can produce. The reason the energy climbs so steeply is worth making concrete, because it comes down to physical size. The magnitude of an earthquake, in the modern moment magnitude scale seismologists use, is essentially a measure of three things multiplied together. How much area of the fault broke, how far the two sides slipped past each other, and how stiff the rock is. Push up the magnitude by a full unit, and you're not talking about a slightly bigger crack. You're talking about a rupture that broke a vastly larger patch of fault, over a much greater distance of slip. A magnitude 7 might rupture a fault patch some tens of kilometers long. A magnitude 8 ruptures a patch that can stretch a couple of 100 kilometers or more, with slip measured in many meters instead of 1 or 2. The 2017 earthquake tore a rupture that extended well over 100 kilometers, with peak slip on the order of 10 meters or more in places. That is why the numbers 7.3 and 8.2, which look like near neighbors on a page, describe events on completely different scales of destruction. One broke a room, the other broke a city block, and the terrifying implication is that the same trench that produced the 8.2 is physically capable of assembling a rupture that large again, and there is nothing about yesterday's modest 7.3 that discharges that possibility. And here is where that distinction I asked you to hold on to comes back. The 2017 earthquake was not the same kind of earthquake as yesterday's. Yesterday's was an interface megathrust, the two plates unlocking along the surface where they touch. The 2017 event was an intraslab earthquake. It ruptured deep inside the descending Cocos plate itself, around 70 kilometers down, as the slab bent and tore under its own tremendous stress. In fact, the way it ruptured was so severe that researchers who studied it described it as an energetic slab detachment, the diving plate essentially tearing a piece of itself away as it plunged into the mantle. Some of the coverage at the time described it vividly as an earthquake that split a tectonic plate nearly in two. Think about what that tells us. This single trench, this one boundary off the coast of Mexico, has at least two different ways to produce a catastrophic earthquake. It can unlock at the interface, the way it did yesterday, the way it does most often, or it can snap the descending slab deep inside the earth, the way it did in 2017. Both are capable of magnitudes that dwarf what we just experienced, and the Geological Survey put a hard number on this history. 7 earthquakes of magnitude 7.0 or larger have struck within 155 miles of yesterday's epicenter since 1950. 7 of them in the span of a single human lifetime. The largest, that 2017 8.2. And the 2017 event is not even the only monster this coastline has produced in living memory. Go back to the 19th of September, 1985. A magnitude 8.0 earthquake ruptured the interface off the Mexican state of Michoacán, out along this same subduction system where the Cocos Plate dives under North America. The epicenter was offshore, hundreds of kilometers from the capital, and yet the earthquake that people remember from that day is the one that struck Mexico City, more than 200 miles away, where thousands of people died as buildings collapsed. That distance is the whole lesson. Mexico City sits on the bed of an ancient drained lake, a basin of soft, water-saturated sediment, and when the seismic waves from that distant offshore rupture arrived, the soft ground did something treacherous. It amplified them. It caught the shaking and rang like a bowl of jelly, magnifying the waves and stretching them out until buildings of a certain height swayed themselves apart. An earthquake 200 miles away leveled parts of a capital city because of what lay beneath that city's foundations. Hold that thought, because it is going to matter enormously when we talk about the soft basins beneath Los Angeles and about what a distant rupture can and cannot do to a place far from the fault. So yesterday's 7.3 is not an outlier. It is a member of a large and well-documented family. This coastline produces major earthquakes on a regular basis, and it has produced earthquakes far larger than the one we just saw. That is the context a seismologist carries in their head when the alert comes in. Not panic, not surprise, but recognition. Ah, this place again, doing the thing it does, and this is worth pausing on, because it points to something hopeful buried inside a frightening subject. Mexico has learned from its earthquakes. After the devastation of 1985, the country built one of the world's first earthquake early warning systems, one that can give Mexico City precious tens of seconds of warning before the shaking from an offshore rupture arrives, along with drilled evacuation routines and updated building codes. A society that lives on top of a machine like the Middle America Trench does not get to make it stop. What it can do is prepare, so that when the machine does what it inevitably does, fewer people die. That is the entire lesson of comparing earthquakes across different places, and it is a lesson we covered in depth in our recent video on the earthquakes in Venezuela, Japan and California, where the same magnitude produced wildly different death tolls depending entirely on how ready each place was. Geology sets the size of the earthquake. Human preparation decides how much of it becomes a tragedy. Keep that in mind as we turn toward California, because the West Coast has spent decades preparing for exactly the kind of event its faults are storing up. Which raises an obvious and reasonable question. If this is so normal, if this trench does this all the time, then why does yesterday's earthquake, of all the earthquakes this place has produced, have anyone talking about the west coast of the United States? Mexico gets big earthquakes. Everyone who studies this knows Mexico gets big earthquakes. What made this one, on this day, swing the conversation more than 1,000 miles north? The answer is not in the earthquake. I need you to really hear that, because it is the hinge the entire story turns on. The answer is not in the size of the earthquake or the mechanism or the aftershocks or the tsunami. The answer is in the calendar. This earthquake arrived at a very specific moment, a moment when three other things happened to be true about the west coast of the United States all at once. And when you lay the Mexican earthquake down on top of those three things, a pattern appears that is genuinely, legitimately worth being nervous about. But before I show you that pattern, I have to deal with the objection that is probably already forming in your mind, the same objection that is currently spreading across social media in the form of maps and arrows and breathless warnings. The idea that the Mexican earthquake somehow reached out and pushed on California directly, that it started a chain, that one plate moving set off the next, like dominoes running up the Pacific coast toward the San Andreas. It is an intuitive idea. It feels right. And in the specific mechanical sense that most people mean it, it is wrong. To show you why, I have to trace what the Mexican earthquake actually did as its energy left the trench and spread across the continent, because it did reach California, just not in the way the maps online would have you believe. Part 5. The wave that crossed a continent. About an hour after the seafloor tore open off Mexico, a seismograph station near Yellowstone, more than 1,000 miles away, twitched. A clean, sharp arrival marched across the readout, unmistakable to anyone who knew how to read it. It was the earthquake, not an earthquake near Yellowstone. The earthquake, the one in Mexico. Its energy had crossed the entire width of the western United States, passed underneath deserts and mountain ranges and cities, and announced itself on an instrument in Wyoming. And that single fact, that quiet twitch on a distant needle, is the key to understanding the real relationship between Mexico and the West Coast. When a large earthquake ruptures, it sends out several different kinds of seismic waves, and they travel at different speeds. The fastest are called P waves, primary waves. They are compressional waves, the same type as sound waves, pushing and pulling the rock in the direction they travel, and they race through the deep earth at speeds that can exceed the ceiling of what you would believe, thousands of miles per hour. Behind them come the slower S waves, and slower still, the surface waves that do most of the damage near an epicenter. But it is the P wave that arrives first, and it was the P wave signature from the Mexican earthquake that showed up on that Yellowstone area station about an hour after the rupture, exactly on schedule for a wave that had traveled that far through the planet. That timing is not a coincidence or an estimate. Seismologists have such precise models of how fast waves travel through the Earth's interior that they can predict, to within seconds, when the P wave from a given earthquake will arrive at any station on the globe. The arrival near Yellowstone landed right where the timetable said it would, which is itself a small confirmation that everything about this event was ordinary, well-behaved, and exactly what the physics predicted. Now, why does this matter? It matters because it is the literal physical thread connecting the two coastlines, and it is completely real. The Mexican earthquake genuinely did shake the ground that the San Andreas fault runs through, genuinely did pass its energy through California. That is not speculation. It is recorded on instruments up and down the west coast. When someone online posts that the Mexican earthquake was felt across the western United States, in the narrow sense of seismic waves arriving on sensors, they are correct. But here is the crucial distinction, and it is the distinction that separates real science from a scary graphic. There is an enormous difference between an earthquake's waves passing through a distant region and an earthquake actually transferring stress to a distant fault in a way that brings it closer to failure. The P wave that registered near Yellowstone did not load the faults under Wyoming. The seismic energy that swept through California did not meaningfully wind up the San Andreas. Those waves are a passing tremor, a vibration that moves through and continues on. They rattle the instruments. They do not in any lasting way change the stress balance on a fault 1,000 miles from the source. Think of it like this. If you strike a bell in one room and a wine glass in the next room rings faintly in sympathy, the sound has genuinely travelled from the bell to the glass. Energy moved between them, but the bell did not push the glass off the shelf. The vibration passed through and faded. That is what the Mexican earthquake did to California. It rang the instruments. It did not push the fault off the shelf, and the same seismographs near Yellowstone that caught the Mexican P wave were, on that very same day, recording a swarm of small local earthquakes underneath the caldera. dozens of tiny events in a couple of clusters. Those Yellowstone quakes were homegrown, part of that region's normal restless behavior, and they had nothing to do with Mexico either. The instrument was simply doing its job, catching both the distant giant and the local whispers, and it takes a careful reader to keep them straight. It is worth understanding just how routine this actually is, because the fact that a Mexican earthquake registered in Wyoming sounds exotic until you realize it happens with every large earthquake on the planet. Seismologists have a word for waves that arrive from very far away. They call them teleseismic, from the Greek for distant. A network of thousands of seismometers spread across the globe records the teleseismic waves from every significant earthquake, no matter where it strikes. A large quake in Chile is recorded in Norway. A rupture in Japan is captured in Africa. The waves travel down through the deep interior of the Earth, bending as they pass through layers of different density, refracting off the boundary between the mantle and the core, and emerging on the far side of the planet to nudge a needle in some quiet observatory. It is, when you think about it, one of the few ways we have of directly sensing the deep structure of our own planet. Every distant earthquake is a flashbulb, and the waves that ripple out from it illuminate the Earth's insides for anyone with the instruments to watch. The reason the P wave arrives first, an hour before the slower waves have finished their journey, comes down to how each type of wave moves the rock. The P wave, the primary wave, is a compression, squeezing and stretching the ground along its direction of travel, and compression moves fast, faster than any other seismic wave, screaming through the deep mantle at speeds that can climb well above 10 kilometers every second as the rock gets denser with depth. Behind it comes the S wave, the secondary or shear wave, which shakes the rock side to side perpendicular to its travel and moves more slowly. And last of all come the surface waves, which are trapped near the skin of the planet and roll along it like swells on the ocean. Those surface waves are the slow, powerful, long-period rollers that do the real damage near an epicenter, and they are also, crucially, the ones that carry shaking energy the farthest. Keep that fact in your pocket. The surface waves are the ones that matter when we ask in a few minutes whether a distant earthquake can touch a distant fault. So we have established something important. The Mexican earthquake reached California physically, as a passing wave, but not mechanically, not as a transfer of stress that could hasten a rupture. And yet the intuition that these things must be connected is so strong and so widespread that I do not want to just assert this and move on. I want to actually walk you through the physics of how one earthquake can and cannot affect a distant fault. Because there is a real mechanism here, a real and documented way that earthquakes influence each other across distance, and understanding its limits is the difference between being informed and being frightened by a map. There are, it turns out, two very different ways an earthquake can touch another fault. One of them dies almost immediately with distance. The other can reach much farther than you would expect, and which one applies here decides everything. Part 6. The push that doesn't reach. The first way an earthquake can affect a nearby fault is the one that feels most obvious, and it is the one that gives us the domino image everyone reaches for. It is called static stress transfer, and it is completely real. When a fault ruptures, the rock on either side physically moves, sometimes by several meters. That movement does not just release stress on the fault that broke, it rearranges the stress on every fault in the neighborhood. Some nearby faults get unloaded, pushed further from failure. Others get loaded, squeezed closer to their own rupture. Seismologists map these changes carefully, and they have watched, in case after case, a large earthquake nudge its neighbors, sometimes triggering a second major quake nearby months or years later. This is a genuine phenomenon, and it is why a large earthquake in a region really can raise the odds of another one on an adjacent fault. So the instinct that earthquakes beget earthquakes is not crazy. It is grounded in real physics. But, and this is the entire point, static stress transfer has a range, and that range is short. Brutally short, in the context of what we are talking about. The rearrangement of stress from a rupture falls off extremely quickly with distance. As a rule, the meaningful effects are confined to something like 1 or 2 fault lengths from the rupture. For an earthquake like yesterday's, that means the stress changes worth talking about extend a few tens of kilometers out to perhaps 100 or so at the very outer edge. Within that zone, yes, the Mexican earthquake genuinely reshuffled the stress on neighboring faults, which is exactly why the observers watching the region were checking for any sign of that stress migrating along the Caribbean plate boundary nearby. And that check is instructive, because it shows you where the real, physical influence of this earthquake lives and how tightly it is confined. Just to the southeast of the rupture lies a tangle of plate boundaries where the North American, Cocos and Caribbean plates all meet, one of the more complicated tectonic knots on the planet. When a large earthquake fires along the Middle America Trench, the natural place to watch for a response is right there, in that nearby knot, where the stress changes are large enough to matter. The observers looked, and in this case, they reported not seeing any obvious sign of stress migrating into the Caribbean plate boundary in the immediate aftermath, no unusual uptick in the region next door. That is a local question, asked about faults within a few hundred kilometres of the rupture, and it is the correct question to ask. Notice what nobody serious was doing. Nobody was watching for the stress to migrate to California, because there is no physical pathway for that to happen. The influence of this earthquake, real and worth monitoring, extends to its neighbours in Central America and the Caribbean. It does not and cannot extend to the west coast of the United States. The zone of genuine concern is a regional one, drawn tight around the rupture, and California sits far, far outside it. But the San Andreas fault is not a few tens of kilometres from the Middle America Trench. It is more than 1,000 miles away. Across that distance, static stress transfer is not weak. It is not small. It is, for all practical purposes, zero. The permanent stress change delivered to the San Andreas by yesterday's earthquake is so vanishingly tiny that it disappears beneath the noise of the fault's own daily existence. It is less than the stress change the San Andreas experiences from the gravitational tug of the moon and the sun as they raise tides in the solid rock of the earth twice a day. It is nothing. To put the distance in terms your body can feel, consider that the drive from the epicenter region off southern Mexico to the southern end of the San Andreas would take you across the entire width of Mexico and up into the United States, well over 1,000 miles by road. Now recall that static stress transfer meaningfully operates over something like 1 or 2 fault lengths, a matter of tens of kilometres. The San Andreas is not tens of kilometres from this rupture. It is more than 1,000 miles, which is to say it is something like 50 to 100 times farther away than the outer edge of where this earthquake's permanent stress changes have any real effect. Asking whether this earthquake loaded the San Andreas through static stress transfer is a bit like asking whether dropping a stone in a pond in one city could raise the water level in a lake in another. The ripple is real where it happens. It does not cross the distance. This is why the seismologists watching yesterday, the ones actually reading the data, were not looking for pressure to migrate from Mexico into California. They know the geometry. They know that between the Middle America Trench and the San Andreas lie multiple independent plate boundaries, thousands of miles of separate geology, each with its own stress budget, its own faults, its own clock. The Cocos plate diving under Mexico is a fundamentally different system from the Pacific plate grinding past North America along the San Andreas. They are not links in a single chain. They are separate machines running in separate rooms, and static stress transfer cannot carry a meaningful push from one to the other. So when you see a map online with a bold arrow sweeping from the Mexican epicenter up the coast to Los Angeles, with a warning that the pressure is moving north, that the big one is being triggered, understand exactly what you're looking at. You're looking at the domino intuition, applied at a distance where the physics that would justify it simply does not operate. The dominoes are real, but they are inches apart, not 1,000 miles apart. Static stress transfer is a local phenomenon dressed up online as a continental one. Seismologists even have a formal way of calculating this. They call it Coulomb stress change, and it lets them map, after a big earthquake, exactly which surrounding faults got pushed closer to failure and which got relaxed. The faults that get loaded show up as regions of increased Coulomb stress, sometimes vividly correlated with where aftershocks then cluster. The faults that get unloaded sit in what are called stress shadows, quieted for a time because the earthquake actually relieved some of their burden. And the real-world track record of this is compelling, which is exactly why it is so important to pin down its range. Consider Southern California's own history. In 1992, the Landers earthquake struck the Mojave. 7 years later, in 1999, the Hector mine earthquake, a magnitude 7.1, ruptured a fault not far away. An analysis suggested that the stress changes from Landers had helped load the fault that produced it. That is static stress transfer doing its documented work, a large earthquake raising the odds on a neighbour. But look at the distance. Hector Mine was a stone's throw from Landers in geological terms, a few tens of kilometres, right inside the zone where static stress change is potent. That is the scale at which this mechanism operates. Neighbours nudging neighbours across a shared patch of desert, not a rupture off Mexico reaching across the entire continent to a fault in another country. And if that were the only way earthquakes could influence distant faults, we would be done. We could close the book on any connection between Mexico and California and move on. But it is not the only way. There is a second mechanism, and this one is stranger, more surprising, and reaches much, much farther. It is the reason a small asterisk has to go next to everything I just told you. Because while the permanent push does not reach California, the passing wave, that P wave, those surface waves rolling through, can, under the right conditions, do something that static stress cannot. And to understand the honest, complete answer to whether Mexico can touch the San Andreas, we have to look at the one mechanism that genuinely crosses continents. Part 7. The reach of a passing wave. In the summer of 1992, a magnitude 7.3 earthquake struck the Mojave Desert of Southern California, near a town called Landers, and in the hours after it, something happened that startled seismologists and rewrote part of the textbook. Small earthquakes began popping off at sites hundreds of kilometres away from Landers, far outside the range where any static stress change could possibly reach. Up in the geothermal fields, out at distant volcanic centres, places that had no business responding to an earthquake that far away suddenly lit up with tiny quakes, and the timing left no doubt they were connected to Landers. That event became one of the founding cases for a phenomenon we now call dynamic triggering. Here is how it works. When the static push fades with distance, the seismic waves keep going. The surface waves in particular, the slow, rolling waves that travel along the skin of the planet, can carry significant shaking energy for enormous distances. And as those waves pass through a distant region, they do not deliver a permanent stress change. They deliver a transient one, a brief, oscillating stress, a squeeze and a release that lasts only as long as the waves are passing through. For most faults, in most places, that passing jostle does nothing. The fault absorbs it and carries on. But for a fault that is already right at the edge, already so close to failure that it needs only the smallest nudge, that passing wave can occasionally be enough to set off a small rupture that was going to happen soon anyway. And Landers was not a fluke. The clearest, most famous demonstration of just how far this reach can extend came a decade later, and it happened at a place we have already mentioned in this very video. In November of 2002, a magnitude 7.9 earthquake struck the Denali Fault in the interior of Alaska, and within minutes to hours, as its surface waves rolled south across the continent, earthquakes began triggering at sites more than 3,000 kilometers away. One of the places that lit up was Yellowstone. The passing waves from an Alaskan earthquake disturbed the geothermal plumbing beneath the Yellowstone caldera, and the ground there responded with a swarm of small quakes, along with changes in the behaviour of some of its geysers. Think about the symmetry with what we are discussing. Yesterday, the P wave from the Mexican earthquake registered on a seismograph near Yellowstone. 20-some years ago, an earthquake in Alaska actually set off small quakes at Yellowstone as its waves passed through. This is the mechanism in action, and it demonstrates beyond any doubt that the shaking from a great earthquake can reach out across a continent and, at just the right kind of critically primed, fluid-rich location, nudge the ground into a small response. That is dynamic triggering, and it is real, documented and genuinely capable of reaching across the kind of distance that separates Mexico from California. So does that mean the Mexican earthquake could have triggered something on the San Andreas after all? This is where I have to be very careful and very honest with you, because the truthful answer has an asterisk on both sides. On the one hand, yes, in principle, the surface waves from a magnitude 7.3 can travel to California and impose a brief, oscillating stress on the faults there. That much is physically possible, and it is the grain of truth inside the fear. On the other hand, dynamic triggering has some very important limits that the scary version always leaves out. First, it overwhelmingly favours faults that are critically stressed and, crucially, rich in fluids, which is why geothermal and volcanic areas are its favourite targets. The mechanism seems to work in part by disturbing pressurized fluids in the fault zone. Second, and most important, dynamic triggering almost always produces small earthquakes. It nudges systems that are ready to produce a little event into producing that little event a bit sooner. It has never been shown to conjure a great earthquake out of a fault that was not already on the very brink of one on its own. It does not create the big one. At most, it might occasionally adjust the timing of something small that was already coming. And there is one more limit, the most important of all. Even if the surface waves from Mexico did impose a transient stress on the San Andreas as they passed, and even if the San Andreas is critically stressed, which we are about to see it may well be, the waves have now passed. They came, they rolled through, and they are gone. A transient stress is transient. If it did not trigger something in the moments it was present, its opportunity is over. It does not linger. It does not accumulate. It does not leave the fault more loaded than it found it. Whatever the Mexican earthquake was going to do to California, dynamically, it already either did in the hours around the rupture, in the form of maybe a few extra tiny quakes we might never even distinguish from the background, or it did nothing at all. There is no delayed effect building toward a distant catastrophe, and there is a deeper reason a passing wave cannot manufacture a great earthquake, one rooted in what a great earthquake actually is. To produce a magnitude 7 or 8, you need an enormous patch of fault, tens or hundreds of kilometers of it, that is already locked, already loaded to near its breaking point, and ready to fail as a single coordinated rupture. That condition takes centuries to build and cannot be conjured by an outside nudge. The transient stress from a distant earthquake's surface waves is measured in fractions of the stress a fault carries on its own. It is a feather laid on a scale that is already holding tons. If that patch of fault is genuinely at the edge, the feather might tip a small corner of it into a minor event a little sooner than it would have gone anyway. But it cannot supply the vast reservoir of stored energy that a great earthquake requires. That energy has to already be there, painstakingly accumulated over a human lifetime or many of them. This is the final nail in the domino theory. The big one, when it comes, will not be borrowed from Mexico or Alaska or anywhere else. It will be paid for entirely out of stress that California itself has been saving up, penny by penny, since the last time the fault let go. The trigger, whenever it comes, will be almost incidental. The loaded gun is the whole story, and the gun is homemade. So here is the complete, honest answer to the question the title poses. Can the Mexican earthquake affect the San Andreas? Through static stress transfer? No, not at that distance. Not measurably, not at all. Through dynamic triggering, only in the narrowest and most temporary sense, potentially nudging an already critical fluid-rich patch into a small event during the brief window the waves were passing, and never, under any circumstances that science has ever observed, initiating a great earthquake that was not already imminent on its own terms. The Mexican earthquake is not going to cause the big one in California. Full stop. Which means, if the earthquake itself is not the threat to the West Coast, we are left with the real question, the one that has been waiting patiently underneath this entire discussion. If Mexico did not load the gun, then why are the people who study these faults nervous? The answer is that the gun was already loaded. It has been loading for a very long time, and the Mexican earthquake did not add a single round to it. It just made everyone turn and look at how full the chamber already is. Part 8. A stress test of attention. Let me tell you what the Mexican earthquake actually did to California, because it did do something, and it is not what the maps online claim. It performed a stress test, not on the rock, on our attention. For most people, the faults beneath their feet are an abstraction. They are a thing from a documentary, a line on a map, a danger that exists in some hazy someday. Life goes on. The ground is quiet. The abstraction stays abstract. And then, every so often, the earth does something violent and undeniable somewhere else, somewhere close enough to feel connected but far enough to be safe, and for a moment the abstraction becomes real. People look up. They ask questions. Could that happen here? Are we ready? What is actually going on underneath us? The Mexican earthquake was one of those moments. It was an alarm clock ringing 1,000 miles away, and its only real effect on California was to wake people up and make them look at the ground they had been ignoring. And here is the thing about looking. When the seismologists looked, when they turned their attention north in response to the Mexican alarm, they did not see a quiet, safe, well-rested fault system. They saw the opposite. They saw a fault network that, entirely independent of anything happening in Mexico, has recently been confirmed to be carrying more stress than it has in 1,000 years. They saw a specific dangerous junction that has been identified as loaded and ready. And in the north, They saw a silence that, to a trained ear, is one of the most unsettling sounds a fault can make. None of that was caused by Mexico. All of it was already true. Mexico just made us look. This is what I mean when I say the earthquake was a spotlight and not a danger. The danger was already on the stage. It has been standing there in the dark while we went about our lives. The Mexican earthquake simply swung the light around and illuminated it, and now that we can see it, we cannot unsee it. The nervousness the scientists feel is not fear that Mexico triggered something. It is the very specific discomfort of having your attention forced onto a problem you already knew was there and had been trying not to think about. And this is the encouraging flip side of that discomfort, the part I do not want to leave out, because vigilance without agency is just dread. The reason we can talk about all of this with real numbers, the reason we know the stress is at 1,000-year high and the bay is in a seismic gap and the odds are what they are, is that the science is out in the open, and it has been turned into tools you can actually use. The West Coast now has an earthquake early warning system, built on that same network of seismometers that can detect the first fast-moving P wave from a rupture and send an alert to phones across the region before the slower, damaging shaking arrives. It is not prediction. It cannot tell you an earthquake is coming next week. But in the seconds after a fault breaks, it can give people a precious few seconds to drop, cover and hold on, a warning that races ahead of the destructive waves because an electronic signal travels faster than a seismic one. That system exists because people took the silent, loaded reality of these faults seriously and did something about it. So the correct response to everything in this video is not to lie awake in fear. It is to be the kind of person who has water and supplies set aside, who has secured the heavy furniture, who knows that when the ground moves you drop and cover, and who understands that the quiet is not the same as safe. Preparation is the one part of this entire story that is fully within our control, so from this point forward, we're going to leave Mexico behind. The earthquake off that coast has told us everything it can tell us. It was violent. It was normal. It was a member of a well-known family. It could produce far worse, and it reached California only as a passing tremor that changed nothing about the stress on our faults. Its job in this story is done. It was the messenger. Now we turn to the message, and the message is written in the rock beneath Southern California, in a study that reconstructed 1,000 years of accumulated stress and came back with a number that stopped seismologists in their tracks. That is where we go next, and it is where this story stops being about an earthquake somewhere else and starts being about the ground underneath tens of millions of Americans. Part 9. The end of the book. A team of researchers recently did something that sounds almost impossible. They reconstructed 1,000 years of stress on the fault system beneath Southern California. And when they finished, when they added up 10 centuries of accumulated strain and compared today against every year in that record, they found that parts of the San Andreas and the fault right beside it are now carrying more stress than at any point in the last 1,000 years. Not the last 50, not the last 100, the highest in a millennium. That study, published in the Journal of Geophysical Research, is the real reason the word nervous belongs in this story, and it has nothing to do with Mexico at all. I want to explain how you even measure such a thing, because the audacity of it is part of what makes it convincing. You cannot go back 1,000 years with a stress meter. Instead, the researchers built a model of how the faults of Southern California interact, and then they fed a millennium of known earthquake history through it. Every major rupture in the record removes stress from some segments and adds it to others. By running the full sequence of historical earthquakes forward through the model, year by year, they could track how the stress on each fault segment rose and fell over the centuries, building after each quiet stretch, dropping after each rupture, in a slow, grinding rhythm. And what the model shows is that, right now, the needle on several key segments is not just high, it is at the top of the entire 1,000-year chart. This is the rigorous, peer-reviewed version of something the people who watch these faults have been saying in plainer language for a while now. One of them put it the way I keep coming back to. We are at the end of the book. Think about what that phrase means. A fault's earthquake cycle is like a book. It opens the instant after a great rupture, when all the stored stress has just been released and the fault is relaxed, slack, harmless. Then, page by page, decade by decade, the plates keep moving, the fault stays locked, and the stress builds. The book fills up. And the end of the book, the last page, is the great earthquake that releases everything and starts a new volume. When someone who studies the San Andreas tells you we are at the end of the book, they are saying the pages are nearly full. The stress is nearly maxed, and the study just confirmed, with 1,000 years of reconstructed data, that this is not a feeling, it is a measurement. But the study did more than say the stress is high. It identified where the danger concentrates, and it introduced an idea that I find genuinely chilling in its precision. The researchers focused on a place called Cajun Pass. If you have ever driven between the Los Angeles area and the desert to the northeast, you have gone through it. It is a mountain pass, a corridor, and it happens to be the place where two of Southern California's great fault systems, the San Andreas and the San Jacinto, come close together. And the study describes Cajun Pass as an earthquake gate. An earthquake gate is exactly what it sounds like. It is a junction that can do one of two things when a rupture arrives. It can act as a barrier, a closed gate, stopping the rupture, containing the earthquake to a single fault segment. Or it can act as an open gate, a doorway, allowing a rupture that starts on one fault to jump across and continue onto the other. And whether the gate is open or closed changes everything about how large the resulting earthquake can be. Because a rupture confined to one segment is dangerous. But a rupture that passes through the gate, that starts on the San Jacinto and jumps onto the San Andreas, or the reverse, is a fundamentally larger and more destructive event. The study found that, given the current stress state, a joint rupture crossing Cajun Pass could reach approximately magnitude 7.4 to 7.8, and it would not stay politely out in the desert. It would drive straight toward the Los Angeles basin, toward the homes and freeways and hospitals of one of the largest population centers in the country. The idea of an earthquake gate is worth dwelling on, because it changes how you should picture a big California earthquake. Most people imagine a fault as a single clean line, and an earthquake as a break that runs along it and stops. But the real fault systems of Southern California are not single lines. They are braided, branching networks, and where one fault ends and another begins, there are these junctions, these gates, that either pass a rupture along or halt it. Cajun Pass is one of the most important of them, because it is the place where the San Andreas and the San Jacinto, two of the three great fault systems of the region, run close enough to potentially hand a rupture back and forth. Whether a gate opens or closes in any given earthquake depends on the fine details of the stress, the geometry, the exact way the rupture arrives. And here is why the 1,000-year stress finding is so consequential. A gate under high stress is a gate that is much more likely to open. When the rock on both sides of a junction is loaded near its limit, a rupture arriving from one fault finds it far easier to jump the gap and keep going on to the next. The study is not just saying the faults are stressed, it is saying the gate that could turn a large earthquake into a giant one is loaded in a way that makes it more likely to swing open. And we do not have to imagine what an open gate rupture on the southern San Andreas would do, because it is one of the most carefully studied disaster scenarios in the United States. Emergency planners built an entire exercise around a hypothetical magnitude 7.8 earthquake on the southern San Andreas, a rupture running some 200 miles up the fault toward the Los Angeles region. The modelled results are sobering. Something on the order of 1,800 deaths, tens of thousands of injuries, damage running into the hundreds of billions of dollars, water and power and fuel lines that cross the fault, severed all at once, in some cases taking months to fully restore. Fires breaking out across the basin with a fire service unable to reach them because the roads are broken and the water mains are cut. That scenario was not built on fear. It was built to be as realistic as the science allows, precisely so that the region could prepare. And the magnitude at its centre, 7.8, sits right inside the range the 1,000-year stress study says a Cajun Pass rupture could reach. Sit with that magnitude range for a second, 7.4 to 7.8. Yesterday off Mexico we watched a 7.3. We watched what that looks like, the aftershocks, the energy, the reach. Now imagine an earthquake of that scale or larger, not out at sea, not 150 miles offshore, but tearing through a mountain pass on the doorstep of a metropolitan region of millions of people. That is the scenario the 1,000-year stress study puts on the table, and it is not science fiction. It is the documented present-day condition of the faults, sitting there in a peer-reviewed journal, waiting. There is a phrase in that finding that deserves to be unpacked, because it is easy to hear higher stress in 1,000 years and let it wash over you as just another superlative. Think about what that 1,000-year window actually contains. It contains the 1857 Fort Tillon earthquake on the southern San Andreas. It contains centuries of earlier great earthquakes recorded in the paleoseismic trenches. It contains every build-up and every release that this fault system went through across 10 centuries. And the study is saying that today, right now, several key segments are carrying more stress than at any moment in that entire span, including the moments just before those past great earthquakes. In other words, the fault is not merely loaded. By this reconstruction, it is loaded beyond the levels that preceded some of the largest earthquakes in its known history. That is the weight behind the phrase. It is not a marketing superlative. It is a statement that the current condition of the rock sits at the very top of a millennium-long chart, in territory the fault has historically not stayed in for long before it does something about it. The Mexican earthquake did not create this. It just made us open the book to this page, and there is a specific number inside that study, one segment in particular, that carried the single highest stress load in the entire 1,000-year reconstruction that turns the general alarm into something sharp and specific. That number is where we go next. Part 10. 16 Decades of Silence. There is one segment of fault beneath Southern California that, according to the 1,000-year reconstruction, is carrying the heaviest stress load of all. It is the San Bernardino segment of the San Jacinto Fault, and the study put a figure on it. Roughly 3.6 megapascals of accumulated stress. That single number was higher than that segment's stress at any other point across the entire 1,000 years the researchers modelled, higher even than its previous peak, which came nearly 50 years ago. In other words, this particular stretch of rock has spent the last half-century climbing back to, and then past, a stress level it had not seen in centuries. It is now, by this measure, more loaded than we have ever seen it. It is worth knowing something about the San Jacinto Fault, because it does not get the fame of its famous neighbour, and it probably should. If the San Andreas is the celebrity fault, the one everyone has heard of, the San Jacinto is the quiet workhorse that actually produces more earthquakes. Over the past century, the San Jacinto has been one of the most seismically active fault zones in all of Southern California, generating a steady stream of moderate and occasionally strong earthquakes as it runs from the San Bernardino area southeastward toward the Imperial Valley and the Salton Sea. It runs through and near heavily populated inland communities, and it is fully capable of producing a magnitude 7 in its own right. So when the 1,000-year study singles out the San Bernardino segment of this fault as the single most heavily loaded piece of the whole network, it is not flagging some obscure crack in the desert. It is flagging a segment of one of the region's most active and dangerous faults, right at the junction where it could hand a rupture to the San Andreas, sitting at the highest stress the model can find anywhere in 1,000 years of history. That is the specific sharp point of the whole study, and it sits directly beneath the inland corridor east of Los Angeles. A megapascal is a unit of pressure, and 3.6 of them accumulated on a fault segment is the kind of abstraction that is easy to let slide past you. So let me anchor it in time instead, because time is the thing your body understands. Stress on a fault is just the physical record of how long the fault has been locked while the plates kept moving. The higher the stress, the longer the wait, the bigger the eventual release. And when we translate the stress on the Southern California faults into time, we arrive at some genuinely sobering numbers. The southern San Andreas, the stretch that runs up from the desert toward the Los Angeles region, last produced a great earthquake in the year 1857. That was the Fort Tejon earthquake, an event estimated at around magnitude 7.9, one of the largest earthquakes in California's recorded history. It tore roughly 200 miles of the fault, and since that day, that segment of the San Andreas has been locked and loading. Do the arithmetic. From 1857 to today is about 169 years. 169 years of the Pacific Plate grinding northwest past North America at a few centimeters a year, and that stretch of the San Andreas holding it all in, storing every bit of that motion as strain. The average interval between major ruptures on that part of the fault is estimated to be shorter than the time that has already elapsed, which is the scientific way of saying we're not just due, we are on average overdue. How do we even know the average interval when we have only been keeping written records in California for a couple of centuries? This is one of the quiet triumphs of earthquake science, a field called paleoseismology, the study of ancient earthquakes. Along the San Andreas, in places where the fault crosses old marshes and stream beds, researchers dig trenches across the fault and read the layers of sediment like pages in a ledger. Each great earthquake leaves a physical scar in those layers, a place where the ground was ruptured and offset and then buried by later deposits. By carefully dating the layers above and below each scar, using the radiocarbon in bits of ancient plant material, paleoseismologists have reconstructed a record of San Andreas earthquakes, stretching back well over 1,000 years, long before any human wrote a word about them. One of the most famous of these sites, at a place called Pallet Creek, revealed a long series of past great earthquakes on the southern San Andreas, and the intervals between them varied, but averaged very roughly a century and a half, with some gaps shorter and some longer. 1857 was the most recent entry in that ledger, and we are now, depending on which stretch and which estimate you use, at or beyond that average spacing. You can even see the 1857 earthquake with your own eyes, frozen into the landscape. Out on the Carrizo Plain, in a starkly beautiful stretch of central California, the San Andreas runs across open ground, and there you can see stream channels that were flowing straight until the fault jerked sideways and offset them, leaving them with a distinctive dogleg kink where the earthquake shoved one side of the land past the other. Some of those offsets record the sudden lurch of 1857, meters of movement in a matter of seconds, preserved in the shape of the land for more than a century and a half. It is one of the few places on Earth where you can stand and physically read the signature of a great earthquake in the ground itself, a permanent reminder that this fault does not creep politely. When it goes in a violent jump, and the last time it jumped here, there was no Los Angeles to speak of. This is what the observers mean when they say the fault is at the end of its book, and it is what the 1,000-year study confirms with hard data. The southern San Andreas has been silent for 16 decades, and that silence is not peace. It is accumulation. Every quiet year is another year of stress added and not released, another turn of the spring. The fault has been doing, slowly and invisibly, exactly what the Mexican fault did suddenly and violently yesterday, except it has not yet reached the release. It is still winding, and unlike the Mexican Trench, which sits offshore and points its worst energy at open water, the San Andreas runs directly through the most heavily populated corridor of the American West. Now, I have to say the responsible thing here, and I want to say it clearly, because the difference between vigilance and panic is the difference between this channel and a doomsday reel. Being overdue is not the same as being imminent. Faults do not run on schedules. The average interval is an average, not an appointment. The southern San Andreas could rupture this year, or it could hold for another 50. Stress reaching a 1,000-year high tells us the system is loaded, that the consequences of failure are severe, and that the probability is elevated. It does not tell us the date. Anyone who gives you a date is selling something. What the science gives us is not a prediction. It is a condition, and the condition is that the ground beneath Southern California is more stressed than it has been since before the modern world existed, since a time when there were no cities there at all. But loaded faults, at least, announce themselves through stress that we can measure. There is a second signal on the west coast that is harder to read, and in its own way, more unsettling, because it is not a sound at all. It is the absence of one. Because while Southern California's faults are groaning under record stress, 400 miles to the north, around one of America's great cities, the ground has gone quiet. Too quiet. And to the people who know how to listen, that silence is saying something specific. Part 11. The Silence in the North. There is a kind of quiet that is peaceful, and there is a kind of quiet that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up, and the trick is knowing which one you are hearing. Right now, around San Francisco Bay, the ground has gone into the second kind of quiet, and the people who watch it are not relaxing. They are leaning in. Here is the setup. A healthy, active fault system is not silent. It grumbles. It produces a steady patter of small earthquakes, ones and twos and the occasional three, as the rock adjusts and creeps and releases little bits of stress along the way. That background chatter is, in a strange way, reassuring, because a fault that is releasing stress in small doses is a fault that is not storing all of it up for one enormous release. Now look at the map of Northern California over the last week. To the north, there is activity. To the south, there is activity. And right in the middle, across the Bay Area, along the very heart of the San Andreas system, there is a gap. A dead zone. Only a couple of tiny 1-point-something earthquakes over an entire week, where you would normally expect a steady murmur. The activity to the north and south runs up to the edge of the Bay region, and then just stops. One of the observers watching this described it, half joking, as if a giant dome had been placed over the Bay Area, or as if the faults had been glued together, held shut. It is a joke that carries real unease underneath it, because a locked, silent fault segment surrounded by active ones is a textbook description of something seismologists call a seismic gap. A seismic gap is a stretch of a fault that has gone conspicuously quiet, while the segments around it stay active, and the concern is straightforward. If the neighbouring segments are releasing stress and this one is not, then this one is not stress-free. It is stressful, it is locked, holding, accumulating, precisely because it is not letting go in small pieces. The silence is not the absence of danger. The silence may be the danger, wound tight, and waiting. And this is not a hypothetical part of the map. The Bay Area's piece of the San Andreas is the same fault system that produced the great earthquake of 1906, the one that levelled and burned San Francisco, an event of around magnitude 7.9. That earthquake ruptured an astonishing length of the fault, nearly 300 miles of the northern San Andreas, tearing all at once from near the town of San Juan Bautista in the south up past San Francisco and out to sea. The shaking itself did tremendous damage, but it was the fire that followed that destroyed most of the city, as broken gas lines ignited and ruptured water mains left firefighters helpless to stop the flames, which burned for days and consumed the heart of San Francisco. Thousands died, and here is the part that connects it to the present silence. The 1906 earthquake released the stress on that portion of the fault, opening a new book. But that was 120 years ago. For 120 years, that northern stretch has been reloading, and while it likely has not yet accumulated the full burden it carried in 1905, the segment just to the south, the one running down through the bay and toward the Santa Cruz Mountains, keeps its own separate clock. This is the fault system now sitting in a conspicuous week-long hush, and the quiet zone in the recent data reaches down toward the Santa Cruz Mountains, the exact segment that ruptured in 1989 in the Loma Prieta earthquake, the magnitude 6.9 that struck during a World Series game and collapsed a double-decker freeway. These are not abstract fault lines. They are proven killers with names and dates and death tolls, and right now that stretch of the system is holding its breath. There was one small exception in the recent data, and it is worth noting because of where it sits. A magnitude 3.0 struck in the Santa Cruz Mountains and Gilroy area, with a couple of smaller quakes clustered nearby. That cluster sits right on the San Andreas plate boundary, at a spot where the fault branches, sending off strands that become the Hayward Fault and the Calaveras Fault, two of the most dangerous faults in the Bay Area in their own right. The Hayward Fault in particular runs directly beneath densely populated East Bay cities, and is considered by many to be one of the most urgently dangerous faults in the country. So even the little 3.0 is a reminder that this quiet region is threaded with faults that are anything but harmless. The Hayward Fault deserves a moment of its own, because it is the sharpest example of the overdue clock problem in the entire Bay Area. The last time it produced a major earthquake was in 1868, an event so destructive for its time that it was known for decades simply as the Great San Francisco Earthquake, until 1906 took that title. The Hayward Fault has a relatively well-understood rhythm, with major earthquakes recurring on average roughly every 150 years or so, based on the paleoseismic record. From 1868 to today is more than a century and a half, and unlike the wide-open Carrizo Plain, the Hayward Fault runs directly beneath one of the most densely built landscapes in the western United States, threading under city after city in the East Bay, under homes and schools and a football stadium that literally straddles the trace of the fault. When the standard hazard forecasts for the region are assembled, the Hayward Fault is consistently one of the largest single contributors to the overall earthquake risk. And this is where I can give you an actual number for the thing we're dancing around, because the scientists who assemble these forecasts have put a probability on it. When they combine everything they know about all the faults of the Greater Bay Area, the accumulated stress, the recurrence intervals, the time since the last rupture on each, they arrive at a striking figure. There is roughly a 70% chance, give or take, of a magnitude 6.7 or larger earthquake striking the San Francisco Bay Area within the next few decades, 70%. That is not a fringe estimate or a doomsday guess. That is the mainstream consensus published forecast, and it has hovered in that range for years. A magnitude 6.7, for reference, is roughly the size of the Northridge earthquake that struck the Los Angeles area in 1994 and caused tens of billions of dollars in damage. So when I tell you the Bay Area is quiet, and that the quiet is unsettling, understand that it sits on top of a formal, published, roughly 7 in 10 probability of a major earthquake in the lifetime of most people watching this. The silence and the statistics are telling the same story. It was a small sound in a large silence, and the silence is the part that matters. And when you pull back and look at the whole state on the day the Mexican earthquake struck, the quiet is nearly everywhere, which is precisely what makes it worth noticing. Across all of California, there was nothing above a magnitude 2.5. Down south, only faint microquake activity around the Ridgecrest and China Lake area, the region that produced a significant earthquake sequence a few years back, now just murmuring at the smallest scale. Along the southern San Andreas, near the bend north of the Salton Sea, a little cluster of very small quakes near Thousand Palms, the kind of tiny events that come and go. Up in the far north, a modest 2.2 southwest of Mount Shasta, that lonely volcano. Even next door in Nevada, only a 3.6 out near Las Vegas after midnight, and a couple of smaller ones. Add it all up and the entire region, from the Mexican border to the Oregon line, spent the day in a near whisper, at the exact moment that a study was telling us the rock beneath it is more stressed than it has been in 1,000 years. A loud earthquake off Mexico, 1,000 miles of quiet ground to the north, and underneath that quiet, a spring wound tighter than any living person has ever measured. That is the picture. That is why the people who watch this are uneasy. Let me connect this back to where we have been, because it is easy to lose the thread across so much ground. The Mexican earthquake was a violent release. The southern San Andreas is a loud, measurable, record-high accumulation of stress that has been building since 1857. And the northern San Andreas, around the bay, is a silent accumulation, a seismic gap, holding its stress without even the small releases that would bleed some of it off. Two different faults, two different signals, both pointing the same direction, one screaming, one silent, both loaded. And a distant earthquake off Mexico, arriving in the same week, turned on the lights so we could finally see both of them at once. If this were only about California, it would be more than enough to be nervous about. But the San Andreas is not the only loaded system on the west coast, and it is not even the one capable of the largest earthquake. There is another, offshore to the north, that has been quietly doing something all its own, and on the same day the Mexican earthquake struck, it was showing signs that it too is loading. That is where we turn now, because the full picture of the west coast is not one clock, it is several, all ticking at once. Part 12. The Other Clock. While everyone was watching Mexico and while the seismologists were turning to look at the San Andreas, something else was happening off the coast of the Pacific Northwest, something that makes no sound a human could hear and shows up on no ordinary earthquake map. Underneath the seafloor from Northern California up to Vancouver Island, a different fault, a much larger and more dangerous one than the San Andreas, was quietly loading itself. And on the very day the Mexican earthquake struck, the instruments watching it recorded a surge in the strange silent signal that betrays what it is doing. The fault is the Cascadia subduction zone, and it is the West Coast's other clock, the one that ticks in a rhythm most people have never heard of. Cascadia is, mechanically, the same kind of beast as the trench off Mexico, an oceanic plate diving beneath a continental one, locked and loading. But Cascadia is bigger, and it is closer to home, running just offshore of Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. And unlike the San Andreas, which can produce a 7.9, Cascadia is capable of a magnitude 9, a full-margin megathrust of the kind that only subduction zones can generate. The last time it ruptured its entire length was in the year 1700. An earthquake so large its tsunami crossed the Pacific and struck Japan 10 hours later, recorded in Japanese records centuries before anyone connected it to a fault off the coast of North America. That was 326 years ago, and Cascadia has been locked and loading ever since. The story of how we even know the exact date is one of the most beautiful pieces of detective work in all of Earth science. Along the coast of Oregon and Washington, there are stands of dead cedar trees, grey skeletons standing in tidal marshes, that geologists came to call ghost forests. Those trees died when the great earthquake of 1700 dropped the coastline several feet in an instant, letting salt water flood in and kill them where they stood. By counting and matching the tree rings, Scientists could tell the trees died in the winter of 1699 to 1700. And then came the astonishing confirmation. In Japan, there are written records of a mysterious tsunami that struck the coast in January of 1700 with no local earthquake to explain it. An orphan tsunami, a wave with no apparent parent. When researchers put the two together, they realized the parent was on the other side of the Pacific. The wave that flooded Japan had been born on the Cascadia Fault off North America and crossed the entire ocean. From the Japanese records, they could pin the earthquake to the evening of the 26th of January, 1700, a fault we cannot see, dated to a single night, from ghost trees on one coast and temple records on another. What that history buys us is a sense of the odds. Paleoseismology at Cascadia, reading buried marsh soils and the layers of sand that ancient tsunamis washed inland, shows that great earthquakes there occur on average every few hundred years, very roughly every 500, though highly irregularly, with some intervals much shorter. 326 years into that cycle, the scientific consensus is that the probability of a great Cascadia earthquake in the next 50 years sits somewhere in the range of roughly 10 to 15% for a full margin magnitude 9, and meaningfully higher, perhaps around 1 in 3, for a rupture of just the southern portion of the fault. Those are not small numbers for an event that could be the worst natural disaster in the history of North America. A full Cascadia rupture would shake for minutes, not seconds, across a region running from British Columbia to Northern California, and then it would send a tsunami racing toward the coast that could arrive in as little as 15 to 20 minutes, faster than any official warning could reach the people standing on the beach. It would flatten coastal communities, sever the highways and bridges that connect the region, and cut off large areas for weeks. The reason so much planning now goes into Cascadia is precisely that it is silent, that it gives almost no warning, and that its cycle is measured in centuries while our memories are measured in decades. It is the ultimate example of the theme running through this entire video. The quietest fault on the west coast is also, in many ways, the most dangerous one, and its quiet is not safety. It is a countdown we cannot hear. Here is the part that ties it to yesterday. Cascadia does not just sit there in perfect silence. Deep down, below the locked zone that will one day produce the great earthquake, the fault does something remarkable. Roughly on a schedule, it slips, silently, over days and weeks, in an event too slow and too gentle to be felt or to register as a normal earthquake. As it does, it produces a faint rhythmic seismic hum called tremor, and that tremor is our window into the deep behavior of the fault. We covered the mechanics of this in detail a few days ago in our video on the rising tremor counts across Cascadia, so I will not rebuild the whole picture here. But the short version is this. This deep, slow slip is not the great earthquake, and it cannot predict the day of the great earthquake. What it does is add incremental load to the locked zone above it, the zone that will eventually fail. Every episode of slow slip is another small turn of that spring, another increment of stress transferred up onto the part of the fault that matters. And on the 17th of July, the tremor tracker for Cascadia logged around 127 slow slip epicenters in a single day, most of them beneath the Vancouver Island ranges. Over the previous 30 days, the count ran into the thousands, around 7,192 epicenters, spread across the length of the margin, with the extreme northern and southern ends of the fault, which had been relatively quiet, now filling in. In other words, over the past month, a broad pulse of this deep slow slip has worked its way along much of the Cascadia margin, quietly loading the locked zone from one end to the other. It is completely silent. It threatens no one today, and it is exactly the kind of thing that, in the long arithmetic of a subduction zone, brings the day of the great rupture incrementally closer. Notice what this does to the story. We now have 3 loaded systems on the west coast, all showing signs of accumulation in the same window. The southern San Andreas, groaning under record stress since 1857. The northern San Andreas around the bay, silent and locked, and Cascadia, offshore to the north, quietly loading its locked zone with a month-long pulse of deep, slow slip. None of these were caused by Mexico. None of them are linked to each other. They are independent systems on independent clocks, but they are all right now in the loading phase of their cycles, and the Mexican earthquake happened to ring the bell that made us look at all of them at once. That coincidence, of attention rather than of physics, is the entire reason this week feels different. Which brings up the question that a lot of people are asking right now, watching earthquakes seem to pop off around the world, Watching Mexico and hearing about California and Cascadia all in the same breath. Is the whole planet waking up? Are earthquakes actually increasing? Is something genuinely changing in the Earth? Or are we just, for the first time, able to see all of it at once? That question deserves a real answer, backed by real numbers, and the numbers tell a story that is more interesting than either the panic or the dismissal. That is where we go next. Part 13. Is the planet waking up? Let me give you the numbers, because this is a question that should be settled with data and not with vibes. So far this year, 2026, the planet has produced about 942 earthquakes in the magnitude 5 range, the 5s from 5.0 to 5.9. We are a little over halfway through the year. The long-term average for a full year is around 1,300 of those. Do the projection. If the second half of the year matches the first, we finish somewhere near 1,900 to 2,000 magnitude 5 earthquakes, comfortably above the long-term average of 1,300. So on that measure, yes, this year is running hot. Move up the scale. In the magnitude 7 range, the truly major earthquakes, the planet has produced 9 so far this year. The long-term average is about 15 in a full year. At the current pace, we would finish around 18, again, slightly above average. The largest of those 9 was a magnitude 7.8 in the Philippines the month before last. And in the magnitude 6 range, the 6s, we're at roughly 73 so far, which projects to something like 140 by year's end, once more a little above the typical count. Across the board, from the 5s to the 7s, 2026 is running modestly above the long-term averages. So does that prove the planet is waking up? Here is where I have to slow you down, because this is exactly the kind of data that gets twisted in both directions. The honest answer is more careful than a headline. Earthquake rates naturally fluctuate from year to year. Some years run above average, some below, and a single year running modestly high is well within the normal range of that fluctuation. Last year, in fact, before a burst of activity in the second half, the global count was running low, behind the average, and then it caught up. This is what these numbers do. They wander around the average. A year that is running a bit high by the middle of summer is a real observation worth noting, but it is not by itself evidence that the fundamental behavior of the planet has changed. And there is a deeper reason to be skeptical of the everything is increasing narrative, one that has nothing to do with the Earth and everything to do with us. Our ability to detect and report earthquakes has exploded over the past few decades. There are more seismometers, better networks, faster data, and instant global communication. 50 years ago, a magnitude 5 in a remote part of the ocean might have been recorded by a handful of stations and mentioned nowhere. Today, it is on a map on your phone within minutes, complete with an alert. So when it feels like there are earthquakes everywhere, all the time, part of what you're experiencing is not more earthquakes. It is more awareness of the earthquakes that were always happening. The baseline itself is dramatic. On any given day, the planet produces earthquakes constantly. In the magnitude 6 range alone, the Earth averages something like 120 to 140 per year, which works out to roughly 1 every 3 days, forever, whether or not any of them makes the news. And you can watch this independence play out on the map right now, on the same day the Mexican earthquake struck. Down in the southwest Pacific off New Zealand, there was a significant earthquake the day before, one that the Geological Survey listed as a 5.9 and that New Zealand's own monitoring agency put a bit higher at 6.3, a reminder that even the magnitude of a single event carries some uncertainty depending on who is measuring and how. That New Zealand activity has been migrating, spreading both north into the Kermadec Trench and south, with additional quakes following. Over in Japan, the Nankai Trough, a subduction zone that Japanese scientists watch with enormous concern because it has produced devastating earthquakes throughout history, registered a 5.2, part of a broader swarm of activity that Trough has shown over the past year and a half. And further north, along the Japan Trench and the Kuril Trench, toward Kamchatka, the same regions that produced that magnitude 8.8 last year, stress continues to build. Here is the thing to notice. New Zealand, the Nankai Trough, the Japan and Kuril Trenches, the Middle America Trench off Mexico, and the San Andreas, all active in the same window, and not one of them connected to any of the others. 5 different plate boundaries, 5 different clocks, 5 separate machines, all doing their own independent thing at the same time, which is exactly what you would expect on a planet with dozens of active boundaries, all of them always running. It looks like a coordinated global event. It is nothing of the kind. It is just the ordinary, constant, planet-wide churn seen all at once. We built an entire video around this exact question a little over a week ago, the one on the earthquakes striking Venezuela, Japan and California, seemingly all at once, and the conclusion there is the one that holds up here. The apparent simultaneity of global earthquakes is overwhelmingly a story about detection, media, and the fact that the ring of fire is always active, laid on top of a baseline that is genuinely constantly busy. The plates are independent. An earthquake in Venezuela does not cause one in Japan, does not cause one in California. They are separate machines in separate rooms, and the room we call the Pacific Rim always has something happening in it. But, and I want to be as honest about this side as the other, that does not mean this year's slightly elevated count is nothing. It is worth watching. And there is one specific thing inside the data that the observers keep flagging. There has not yet been a magnitude 8 this year. The most recent magnitude 8 was the 8.8 that struck Kamchatka in the Russian Far East in July of last year, and before that there had been a gap of about 4 years with no magnitude 8 at all. And here is the statistical logic. As the count of magnitude 7s rises, the likelihood of eventually producing something larger rises with it, because the big ones tend to emerge from periods of elevated overall activity. A year running above average on 7s is a year in which the odds of an 8 are a little higher than usual. Not high, not a prediction, but a little higher. And there is a reason the absence of a magnitude 8 matters more than the slightly elevated counts of the smaller quakes, and it comes back to that steep energy curve. Because each step up the scale is roughly 32 times the energy, a single magnitude 8.8, like the one in Kamchatka last year, releases more energy than thousands of the magnitude 5 earthquakes combined. In terms of the actual strain relieved from the planet's crust, one great earthquake dwarfs an entire year of smaller ones. So when we tally the 5s and the 6s and the 7s and find them running a bit above average, we are counting the small change while the real currency, the magnitude 8s and above, is what actually dominates the energy budget of the planet. A year can be busy with 7s and still be waiting on the event that matters most. That is why seismologists keep one eye on that empty magnitude 8 slot. Not because a count of 9 7s is alarming on its own, but because elevated activity in the 7s is, historically, the kind of backdrop against which the truly great earthquakes sometimes emerge. It is a loaded observation, not a prediction, and the honest thing is to hold both of those truths at once. There is also a persistent illusion baked into how we talk about magnitude that feeds the sense of chaos, and it is worth naming. Because the scale is compressed, because a 9 is not much bigger a number than a 6, people's intuition badly underestimates the gulf between them. A magnitude 6 is a serious earthquake that can kill people in a vulnerable city. A magnitude 9 is a civilization-scale catastrophe that reshapes coastlines and crosses oceans. On the page they are 3 numbers apart. In reality they are separated by something like 30,000 times the energy. When a run of moderate earthquakes floods your feed, that compression makes it feel like the big one, and the little ones are all part of one escalating pattern, when in truth they live in entirely different worlds. Keeping the scale straight is one of the best defences against being frightened by a map. It is also what lets you take the genuine signals seriously without drowning in the false ones. The elevated count of 7s this year is a real observation worth filing away. The steady drumbeat of 5s and 6s around the planet is the ordinary background of a living world, and the loaded, silent faults beneath the west coast are the thing that actually deserves your attention. The skill is not in reacting to everything, it is in knowing which of these signals is noise and which one is the quiet, patient warning. So the honest read on the global picture is neither the planet is waking up nor nothing is happening. It is the planet is running a bit warm this year, we are seeing more of it than ever before, the systems are independent, and the elevated count is a reason for attention, not alarm. And that, in the end, is the same lesson the Mexican earthquake taught us, scaled up to the whole planet. The danger is rarely the dramatic event you're looking at. The danger is the slow, quiet, statistical, structural reality underneath it. The thing that was true before the alarm went off and will still be true after. Which brings us all the way back to where we started, and to the single most important idea in this entire story, the one about what silence really means. Part 14. What the silence means. We began with a violent earthquake off the coast of Mexico, and we're going to end with the opposite of an earthquake. We are going to end with silence, because if you take away one thing from everything we have covered, I want it to be this inversion, this counterintuitive truth that sits at the centre of West Coast seismology. On a mature, loaded fault system, it is not the shaking you should fear the most, it is the stillness. Let me pull the whole picture together one last time. Yesterday, the Middle America Trench off Mexico released a magnitude 7.3, a violent but entirely ordinary earthquake, textbook aftershocks and all, on a coastline that has produced far worse and will again. Its energy crossed the continent as a passing wave, ringing seismographs from California to Yellowstone, but it did not and could not transfer any meaningful stress to the faults of the West Coast, because the physics that would allow that dies within tens of kilometers of the source, and the San Andreas is more than 1,000 miles away. We walked through both of the ways one earthquake can touch another, the permanent static push that fades within tens of kilometers, and the fleeting dynamic jostle of a passing wave that can reach across a continent, but only ever nudges an already critical fault into a small event during the seconds it is present. Neither one can build the big one. The big one has to be paid for out of stress the West Coast has saved up on its own, and no distant earthquake can make that deposit for it. The Mexican earthquake was not a trigger. It was an alarm clock, and when that alarm woke everyone up and made them look, here is what the looking revealed. The San Andreas and San Jacinto faults beneath Southern California are carrying their highest stress in 1,000 years, with a specific junction at Cajon Pass loaded and capable of sending a magnitude 7.4 to 7.8 rupture straight into the Los Angeles basin. The Southern San Andreas has been silently loading since 1857, 169 years, longer than its own average interval between great earthquakes. And in the north, around San Francisco Bay, along a fault that has killed before, the ground has gone into a seismic gap, a locked and conspicuous silence, holding its stress rather than releasing it. Meanwhile, offshore to the north, Cascadia loads its own locked zone with a month-long pulse of silent slow slip, 326 years into a cycle that ends in a magnitude 9. Do you see the pattern now? Every one of the most dangerous signals on the West Coast is a quiet one. The record stress on the San Andreas is invisible, silent, building without a sound. The seismic gap around the bay is defined by the absence of earthquakes, by silence itself. The loading of Cascadia is so quiet it makes no felt earthquake at all, only a hum that special instruments have to strain to hear. The loud event, the Mexican earthquake, the one that made all the headlines, was the safe one, the one that changed nothing about our situation. The dangerous things made no noise at all. This is why the scientists are nervous, and it is a very specific kind of nervous, one worth understanding precisely. They are not nervous because Mexico triggered anything. They are nervous because Mexico forced them to look, and what they saw when they looked was a coastline full of loaded silent systems, any one of which could release on its own schedule, with no permission needed from any earthquake anywhere else. The Mexican quake did not add to the danger. It just refused to let us keep ignoring it. And there is something almost unbearable about that, about a threat that has been sitting there in plain sight, measurable, published, mapped, while the ground stays quiet and life goes on, and the quiet gets read as safety when it is the exact opposite. Lay the numbers side by side one last time and the shape of it is undeniable. 169 years of silence on the southern San Andreas. 120 years since the northern San Andreas last let go, with the bay segment holding its own separate breath. More than a century and a half of loading on the Hayward Fault beneath the East Bay cities. 326 years into the Cascadia cycle offshore. The single most stressed fault segment in a 1,000-year reconstruction sitting east of Los Angeles. A roughly 7 in 10 chance of a major earthquake in the Bay Area within a few decades. Not one of those numbers came from Mexico. Every one of them was already true on Thursday, before the trench off Guatemala ever moved. The earthquake did not write a single one of them. It just handed us the page and made us read. I want to be clear one final time about what this is and is not, because the line between vigilance and panic is a line I take seriously. Nothing in this video is a prediction that a great earthquake is coming next week or next month or next year. Loaded is not the same as imminent. Overdue is not the same as scheduled. Faults keep their own time, and the honest scientific position is that we can measure the stress, we can map the danger, we can state the elevated probability, and we cannot tell you the date. What we can tell you is that the West Coast is closer to the end of its cycle than the calm surface suggests, that the systems are more loaded than they have been in centuries, and that a distant earthquake, for all that it changed nothing physically, did us the strange favour of making us look at the truth. So here is where I will leave you tonight, with the question that the people who watch these faults are asking themselves as they stare at the maps. The Mexican earthquake released its stress in a violent, visible instant, and then it began, aftershock by aftershock, to settle back into quiet. It followed the rules. It did the expected thing. But the Bay Area has been silent for a week, in a place that should never be that silent, on a fault that has levelled a city before. Southern California has been silent, in the deeper sense, for 169 years. And the question no one can answer, the one that keeps the lights on late in the monitoring rooms, is simple, and it is patient, and it is waiting. When that silence finally breaks, will it break the way Mexico did yesterday, with a warning we can read in the aftershocks and a wave we can measure in inches? Or will the first sign any of us get be the ground itself moving all at once at the end of a book that has been filling page by silent page for longer than any of us have been alive?